The day Naomi Whitmore buried her father, her husband laughed. Not quietly, not behind a hand. He laughed the way men laugh when they've stopped pretending, loud, loose, aimed directly at her. She was kneeling in the mud beside her father's casket in a black dress that stretched across her body, and Gavin stood 6 feet away with his mistress on his arm, and his mother said the words loud enough for 12 mourners to hear. She couldn't even lose weight for the man's funeral. Naomi didn't scream, didn't move. And across the cemetery, through the rain, a man she had never met watched the whole thing from behind tinted glass and made a decision that would collapse every wall Gavin Mercer had ever built around her. If you've ever been humiliated in your lowest moment, stay until the end. Like this story. Comment the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this has traveled. Let's begin. The rain had been falling since 4 in the morning. By the time the first mourners arrived at Oak Ridge Memorial Cemetery, the gravel paths had gone soft, and the grass along the older plots had turned to a dark, sucking mud that grabbed at heels and soaked through the leather of good shoes. The kind of rain that didn't care about occasion. The kind that fell on funerals and forgotten parking lots with the same flat indifference. Naomi Whitmore had been there since before the gates opened. She'd driven herself in Arthur's old Volvo, the one with the cracked dashboard and the passenger seat permanently adjusted for a man 6 inches taller than her, because she hadn't been able to sleep, and because sitting in the house on Cardwell Street with the hospital bed still set up in the living room and her father's half-finished cup of chamomile still on the kitchen counter had felt like a kind of suffocation she didn't have a name for yet. She'd parked badly, 2 wheels on the grass verge, and she'd sat with her hands in her lap and watched the groundskeepers prepare the plot in the gray pre-dawn light, and she'd tried to feel something simple. She couldn't. Everything she felt was complicated and layered and shot through with the specific guilt that comes from loving someone difficult. Arthur Whitmore had not been an easy father. He had been brilliant, exacting, emotionally remote in the way of men who express love through standards rather than softness. He had pushed her through every academic year with the kind of relentless expectation that leaves a child convinced that sufficient achievement might eventually produce warmth. It never quite had, not the way she'd needed it to. But he'd been hers. For 32 years, he had been the one fixed point in a life that had otherwise shifted constantly beneath her feet. And now someone was going to lower him into a hole in the wet ground and cover him with dirt. And Naomi was going to have to watch that happen while standing next to a man she had understood for years was a mistake. She could already hear Gavin's car in the distance. He arrived with his mother. This was the first thing. Eleanor Mercer stepped out of the passenger seat of Gavin's Audi in a cream wool coat that probably cost more than Arthur's final month of medical bills, and she looked at the weather and at the cemetery and at Naomi standing by the Volvo, and her expression did the thing it always did. It compressed itself into something that wasn't quite contempt, but carried all of contempt's weight, a sort of tolerant displeasure, as though Naomi's existence was a minor inconvenience in an otherwise manageable life. "You parked on the grass," Gavin said, not as a greeting. "I know," Naomi said. He didn't touch her, didn't look at her face. He was already checking his phone, already half somewhere else, wearing a suit that was technically appropriate for a funeral, but that sat on him with the careful ease of a man who had dressed for an impression rather than a loss. Gavin Mercer had never met a public moment he didn't treat as an audition. Eleanor moved past Naomi without acknowledgement and went to speak to the funeral director. Naomi pressed her father's letter against her coat, feeling the fold of the envelope against her sternum. Arthur had given it to her 3 days before the end, when he'd still been lucid, when his hands had still worked well enough to grip hers with that dry professor's grip, all knuckle and deliberateness. "Read it after," he'd said. Not before. After. She had not read it. She was keeping that promise because it was the last one she had to keep. The service was small by design. Arthur had not been a social man. His colleagues from the university came, a handful of historians and department chairs, people who had respected him professionally and known almost nothing about the life he carried home. A few neighbors from Cardwell Street. The young woman from the pharmacy where Arthur had picked up his prescriptions for the last 2 years, who showed up in her civilian clothes with her eyes already red, which told Naomi something about her father that she was storing carefully because she wasn't ready to unpack it yet. And then, 20 minutes in, Vanessa Cole arrived. Naomi had never met her in person. She had found a photograph on Gavin's phone 11 months ago and had not yet decided what to do with the knowledge, which told you something about where her marriage had been for a very long time. Vanessa was 30 years old, narrow through the shoulders, and wearing a dark dress that was perfectly appropriate and cut, but that she wore with the particular consciousness of a woman who understands exactly what she looks like in dark clothes. She stood beside Gavin and touched his arm the way you touch someone you know, not someone you're pretending not to know. Naomi watched this from 3 feet away. She said nothing. The priest spoke. The groundskeepers kept a respectful distance. Rain moved through the trees and the sections behind them, a soft white noise against the leaves. Naomi stood at the graveside and held the envelope and breathed. She was aware of her own body in the way she was always aware of it in public. The weight of it, the space it occupied, the questions she had learned to read in the periphery of strangers' glances. She'd spent her adult life managing that awareness, pressing it down into something functional, turning it into a low hum rather than a roar. Today she was using every skill she'd developed for that management, because today was a day when every nerve was already exposed, and the last thing she had available for armor was her own composure. The service ended. People began moving away from the graveside, back toward the path, back toward cars and the warmth of wherever they'd parked. The small collective grief of the crowd began to disperse into individual grief. And individual grief was private, and private meant navigating back to the car alone while Gavin stood with his hands in his pockets and talked to a colleague from work as though this were a networking event that had run slightly long. Naomi kneeled beside the casket. This was the moment she'd been building towards since 4 in the morning. This was the thing she'd needed to do privately, but couldn't, because grief almost never cooperates with the conditions you need for it. She pressed her hand flat against the polished wood. It was wet and cold and real under her palm in a way the rest of the day hadn't been real yet. "I kept the promise," she said quietly. "I didn't read it yet." She heard Gavin laugh. Not at her, or not directly. He was laughing at something Vanessa said, that particular laugh he had when he was performing ease, loose and theatrical. But he laughed it while standing 6 feet from his wife, kneeling at her father's grave, and the sound of it reached her like something thrown. She was beginning to stand, her heels sinking slightly in the soft, wet earth, when Eleanor Mercer's voice came from somewhere just behind and to her left. "You couldn't even lose weight for your father's funeral." The words landed the way blunt objects land. Not cutting, crushing. Naomi went completely still. She heard, with the specific hyper-awareness of shock, the small sound of amusement from Vanessa. Not laughter, just the breath before laughter, which is somehow worse. She heard one of the remaining mourners clear his throat. She heard her own heartbeat. "I guess grief burns fewer calories than I expected," Vanessa said, lightly, the way you say something that you know is cruel, but that you're framing as a joke, so that anyone who objects to it becomes the humorless one. The remaining mourners were doing the thing people do when something ugly happens in public. They were finding reasons to look elsewhere, at their phones, at the tree line, at the middle distance, the collective performance of not having heard. Naomi had been managing this her entire adult life. The looks, the comments, the way Gavin would sometimes just not mention her in social situations, as though she were an omission rather than a presence. She had a system for it. You exhale slowly through the nose. You keep your face still. You remind yourself that other people's cruelty is a report on them, not a verdict on you. You get through the moment, and then you get through the next moment. She was using the system. She was almost standing. Then Gavin stepped to his right. It was deliberate. She would know this with certainty later, turning it over in the dark of 3 separate sleepless nights. It was deliberate. He shifted his weight and moved his foot into her path, not enough to trip her, just enough to destabilize her footing on the soft ground, and she lurched sideways and went down onto one knee in the mud. Her hand went into the wet earth. Her father's letter stayed pressed against her coat. The laughter from somewhere behind her was brief and immediately stifled, but she heard it. Gavin didn't offer a hand. He looked at his phone. Naomi stayed there for 1 full second. 1 second that she would replay for months, kneeling in the mud at her father's grave with her husband checking his messages 2 feet away. And in that second, she understood something with a clarity that transcended the moment. Not anger, not even grief, just a cold, terrible understanding, She had arranged her entire life around a man who was not capable of being ashamed of himself. She stood up alone. She wiped her hand against her coat. She looked at no one. She walked back toward the Volvo with her father's letter against her chest, and the mud drying on her palm, and the kind of composure that is not peace, but that is, in its own quiet way, a form of survival. She did not see the convoy. She was already past the main path, already past the older section of the cemetery where the stones were close together and moss-covered, when she heard the low particular sound of high-end vehicles on gravel, not hurried, just purposeful, the sound of people who move through the world without accommodating it. She didn't look back. She had nothing left available for curiosity, but the convoy had stopped. Damien Vescari had come to Oak Ridge Memorial Cemetery for a different burial entirely. His older cousin, Marco, not close, not warm, but family in the way that men in his position maintained family as an obligation and a form of record-keeping, had died of a coronary 3 weeks ago and was being placed today in the Vescari family plot on the east side of the cemetery, the plot that Damien's grandfather had purchased in 1974 when the family was still building its first legitimate infrastructure and understood that eventually everyone needs somewhere to put their dead. Damien arrived in the third of 4 vehicles, always the third, never the first or last. His security director, a man named Breck, who said almost nothing and noticed everything, had spent 20 minutes the previous evening reviewing the cemetery layout and adjusting the route 3 times before Damien had told him with considerable brevity to simply choose a path and commit to it. Breck had chosen the north entrance, which brought them past the Whitmore burial. Damien's window was not tinted on the inside from where he sat. He could see out. He saw a woman in a black coat kneel at a grave. He saw an older woman in cream wool lean toward someone beside her and speak, and he watched the woman in black go still in the particular way of someone absorbing a blow that they are refusing to show. He watched a man with his hands in his pockets look at his phone. He watched the woman in the dark dress smile at something. He watched the man shift his weight and the woman at the grave go sideways into the mud, and he watched the man not move, and he watched everyone nearby find things to look at that were not the woman on her knee in the mud at her father's grave. He watched her stand alone. He watched her walk away without looking at anyone. Breck brought the vehicle to a stop. Damien sat for a moment without speaking. He was not a man who rushed responses. This was one of several qualities that made him difficult, and it was also one of the qualities that had kept him alive in a field that was not particularly gentle with men who reacted before they thought. He watched the group at the grave disperse. He watched the man with his hands in his pockets put his arm around the woman in the dark dress and walk back toward the path. He watched the older woman in cream wool smooth her coat with both hands and follow. "Arthur Whitmore," he said, reading the name from the gravestone. Breck checked his tablet. "Professor. University of Chicago, retired, passed 4 days ago. Single daughter. Naomi Whitmore, née Whitmore, that's kept her name. Married to a Gavin Mercer, property developer, mid-range portfolio, currently under 3 separate civil suits. The woman who spoke, that would be Eleanor Mercer, the mother." Damien was quiet for a moment. Then, "Anyone who humiliates a daughter burying her father deserves consequences." Breck made a note. The convoy moved on. The house on Cardwell Street was the kind of house that had been loved in a specific and functional way. Clean, organized, full of books, absent of decoration except where decoration served a purpose. Arthur Whitmore had not been interested in aesthetic comfort. He had been interested in information, in order, in the careful management of what he knew and what he chose to show. The shelves were floor to ceiling in every room except the kitchen. The kitchen had a single framed photograph on the wall, Arthur and Naomi, taken when she was 9, in front of a university building, and nothing else. Naomi sat on the floor of the living room, with her coat still on and her shoes still muddy, and the letter in her hands. She had not opened it yet. She was sitting with it the way you sit with the last moment of something, pressing it out as long as possible, because once you open it, you are fully on the other side of a door that will never open the same direction again. Arthur had been her compass, even when the compass needle made her uncomfortable, even when its true north was in a direction she hadn't wanted to go. And now she was going to read his last words in a room full of his books, in a house she didn't know how to live in alone. The door opened without a knock. Gavin walked in. He was carrying the divorce papers in a manila envelope. He'd had them for at least 2 months. She knew this because the date on the filing was visible when he dropped it on the coffee table in front of her, and the date was 9 weeks ago, 2 weeks before Arthur's condition had worsened to the point where she'd started sleeping at the house. He'd been waiting. That was what the date told her. He'd been waiting for a moment when she'd be weak enough to sign without reading. "I need you to do this today," he said. Naomi looked at the envelope. "My father was buried 4 hours ago." "I know when he was buried," Gavin said. "I was there." He said it with a faint emphasis that she understood immediately. "I was there when I didn't have to be. I was there doing you a favor." As though his presence at her father's funeral were a gesture of extraordinary generosity, rather than the bare minimum of human decency. "The house goes to the estate," he continued, moving into the room and picking up a small ceramic bowl from the shelf near the door, turning it over in his hands with the assessing air of a man calculating resale value. "That's already been established. You don't have an income. Your job at the archive doesn't cover rent on anything in this zip code, let alone maintenance on a property like this. There's nothing keeping you here legally or financially. Signing now is the practical choice." Vanessa appeared in the doorway. She had a phone in her hand and was looking at the living room with the bright, comprehensive attention of someone measuring square footage. "It's actually a nice size," she said, to Gavin rather than Naomi, as though Naomi were a piece of furniture in the room they were assessing. "If you cleared out all these books, it'd photograph well. Could do short-term rental, probably $700 a week in this neighborhood." "There are no proceeds from this property yet," Naomi said. "There will be," Gavin said. "I haven't signed anything." "You will." He set the ceramic bowl down without care, slightly too close to the shelf edge. "You're a practical person. You know when a situation has run its course." Eleanor came in behind Vanessa. She moved through the living room with the same proprietary ease as Gavin, though in her case it was the proprietary ease of a woman who had decided some years ago that her son's belongings were her belongings by extension. She stopped in front of the framed photograph on the kitchen wall. Arthur and 9-year-old Naomi in front of the university building. And she looked at it for a moment with something that wasn't sadness and wasn't interest, and was closest to the particular contempt that some people feel for evidence of other people's happiness. She took it down. She did it quietly, as though the action were incidental, as though she were simply straightening something. Then she set it face down on the counter. Naomi heard the glass crack. She was on her feet before she'd decided to stand. "Put it back." Eleanor looked at her. It was crooked. "Put it back the way it was." "Naomi." Gavin's voice carried the particular warning tone of a man who has decided that his wife's emotions are a social liability. "Don't. That's the only photograph of my father and me in this house," Naomi said. Her voice was very level. This was not calm. This was the voice you find on the other side of calm. The voice that comes when everything else has already been used up. "Pick it up and put it back on the wall." Eleanor looked at Gavin. Gavin looked at his phone. The photograph stayed face down on the counter with its glass broken. Naomi stood in the center of the living room she'd grown up in with her coat still on, and her father's letter in her hands, and the three of them moved around her as though she were an obstacle in their way rather than a person. And she understood with a terrible, complete clarity that this was exactly how it had always been, that the last 4 years of her marriage had been an extended version of this same dynamic, people deciding what she would accept and waiting for her to accept it. She did not say anything else. Gavin left the divorce papers on the table. "Sign them tonight," he said. "I'll have my lawyer contact Miles Harlan in the morning." He said Miles Harlan's name the way you say a name you've already established a relationship with, not introducing it, referencing it, as though he'd already spoken with her father's attorney, as though whatever conversation that had been was already resolved in his favor. They left. Naomi picked up the photograph. The glass had broken in a diagonal across the image, across her own face at 9 years old, across Arthur's arm around her shoulders. She held it and stood in the kitchen and looked at it and finally started crying. Not the composed, controlled grief she'd been managing all day, but the real thing. The ugly, airless kind, the kind that doesn't care about dignity or timing or whether anyone is watching. She cried until the light through the kitchen window changed. She cried until she ran out. Then she wiped her face with the back of her hand and sat down at the kitchen table with the letter. And finally, in the specific quiet of a house that still smelled like her father, library dust and chamomile and old wool. She opened it. Arthur Whitmore's handwriting was the same it had always been. Precise, slightly backward-leaning, the handwriting of a man who had spent 50 years writing on chalkboards and taking notes in margins. Even at the end, even with hands that had started to shake slightly, the letters were formed with intention. Naomi. I don't have the time left to say this the way I spent 30 years trying to figure out how to say it. So here's what's true. I was not the father you needed. I was the father I was capable of being, and those two things were not always the same, and I am sorry for the distance between them. You will meet Miles Harlan within 48 hours of this letter. Let him speak before you react. There are things about my life that I could not tell you while I was in it, because telling you would have endangered you, and there was nothing in any version of my life that mattered more than keeping you safe. I spent 30 years protecting other people's futures because I believed, with everything I had, that the way a man earns his place in the world is by making sure the people he loves are standing on solid ground. You are standing on solid ground, Naomi, even if you cannot feel it yet. The man who may arrive before Miles does, you will know him by the fact that he will not ask you for anything. If he asks for something, send him away. If he asks for nothing, listen. I love you. I was always proud of you. I was not always good at showing you that, and I have no excuse for it, only the knowledge that it was always true. Naomi read it twice. Then she folded it back along its creases and put it in the inside pocket of her coat, against her chest, and she sat for a long time in the kitchen with the cracked photograph face up on the table and the divorce papers sitting where Gavin had left them, and she thought about solid ground. She did not sign the papers. Miles Harlan arrived at 8:15 the next morning. He was 60, compact, with the unhurried precision of a man who charged by the hour and had learned that rushing was a form of inefficiency. He carried a briefcase that was very old and very good, the kind of briefcase that had been expensive once and had aged into something better than expensive. He introduced himself at the door with a directness that Naomi found immediately clarifying. Your father instructed me to come within 48 hours, he said. I'm 13 hours early. There's a reason for that. She let him in. He sat at the kitchen table and opened the briefcase and placed 3 documents on the table with the practice sequence of a man who had arranged them in advance for exactly this delivery, and then he looked at her across the table with an expression that was not unkind, but that was absolutely not going to soften what came next. Your father was not simply a retired history professor, Miles said. He said it the way you say something you've said before, plainly, without embellishment, with the specific economy of a man who has learned that dramatizing revelations doesn't make them easier to absorb. It just delays the processing. Arthur Whitmore served for 29 years as financial strategist, legal guardian, and primary records custodian for a network of high-net-worth private organizations. He paused. Some of those organizations operate in ways that are not fully consistent with federal law. Your father was aware of this. He chose to work with them anyway, not because he shared their methods, but because he believed, and I think he was right, that the kind of stabilizing influence he provided prevented outcomes that would have been considerably worse. Naomi's hands were flat on the table. He was a fixer, she said. He was a guardian, Miles said carefully. The distinction matters. He did not help people commit crimes. He helped prevent crimes from becoming catastrophes. There's a meaningful difference, and your father lived it for 3 decades. He was a professor of history at the University of Chicago. He was also that. Both things were true. Naomi was quiet for a moment. She was assembling something. She could feel the pieces landing, each one changing the shape of what she understood. Arthur's careful privacy. The phone calls he'd taken in the backyard in all weather. The trips he'd described as academic that now, retroactively, had the texture of something else. The absolute refusal, all her life, to discuss money or inheritance or what would happen after he was gone. Because there's nothing to discuss, Naomi. Focus on the work in front of you. There had always been something to discuss. He had simply been protecting her from it. The trust, she said, because the word was in the letter, underneath everything else. Miles nodded. Arthur was custodian of a consolidated trust comprising assets, investments, property holdings, and sensitive records belonging to a network of, let's say, influential families. The trust has a current assessed value of just under $3 billion. He said it without drama. Your father's final legal action, executed 4 months ago, names you as sole successor in the custodial role. Naomi looked at him. He raised me without money, she said. Deliberately. Yes, because he wanted to make sure I didn't. He wanted to make sure you understood value before you understood wealth, Miles said. His word, value before wealth. He wrote it in the succession document. He slid one of the papers across the table. He also wrote this. At the bottom of the page in Arthur's backward-leaning hand, she will want to refuse. Don't let her refuse for the wrong reasons. Naomi stared at it for a long time. Then she heard the cars outside. 4 black SUVs moved up Cardwell Street with a quiet that was almost more alarming than noise would have been. They stopped in front of the house with the coordinated efficiency of people who had done this many times in many places, and had long since stopped feeling the need to announce themselves through anything other than their presence. Miles looked toward the window. Something in his expression changed. Not fear exactly, but the particular alertness of a man who recognizes a category of situation he has spent years learning to navigate carefully. This would be the other part, he said. Of what? Of what your father left you. Naomi stood. Through the kitchen window, she could see men in dark suits moving around the vehicles with the unhurried thoroughness of a security detail that is not expecting a threat but is prepared for one anyway. They covered the side entrance and the gate with the economic precision of people running a protocol rather than a response. Then the front door opened. She hadn't locked it. A man she had never seen before walked through her father's front door and into the kitchen, alone, his security remaining outside. He was tall, dressed in a dark charcoal suit that fit him the way expensive things fit on people who don't need to think about what they're wearing. He was perhaps 40, dark-haired, with the kind of face that had probably never been conventionally handsome, but that carried an authority so absolute it had long since made conventional attractiveness irrelevant. He looked at her. He removed his gloves, one, then the other, with the unhurried attention of a man for whom physical gestures are also a form of communication. And he held them in one hand and looked at her and said nothing for a moment that stretched just long enough to be deliberate. Damien Viscari, Miles said quietly, from the table. Naomi didn't look away from him. Your father once saved my family, Damien said. His voice was low and even, no performance in it. Not financially, that was part of it. But the thing he actually saved was larger than money. He paused. 7 years ago, a situation developed between my organization and 2 others that would have resulted in significant violence. Arthur Whitmore spent 11 days constructing a legal framework and a financial arrangement that gave everyone involved a reason to stand down. He did it without being asked. He did it because he understood that the people who would have paid for that violence were not the men in the rooms making the decisions. Another pause. He never sent an invoice. Naomi's chest was very tight. He told me at the end, Damien continued, when he was close to the end and he was saying the things he needed to say, he told me that if his daughter ever stood alone, the way she'd been standing alone her whole life, and that if anyone ever tried to take from her the ground he'd spent 30 years building under her feet, he reached into his jacket. He placed something on the kitchen table. It was Arthur's old fountain pen. The dark blue one with the gold nib that had lived in the breast pocket of every jacket her father had owned for as long as she could remember. She hadn't seen it since before the illness had taken his ability to write, and she had assumed it was lost, and the sight of it on the table beside Miles's documents and Gavin's unsigned divorce papers hit her with a force that she wasn't remotely prepared for. He wanted you to have it, Damien said. He also said, and here something shifted very slightly in his face, not warmth exactly, but the thing that exists just before warmth, the threshold of it. He said, tell her I know she'll want to do this alone. Tell her that's the point. But tell her also that there's a difference between standing alone and standing unsupported. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, one of the cars idled softly in the street. Naomi's hand found the pen. She held it. You were at the cemetery, she said. It wasn't a question. She didn't know exactly how she knew, but she knew with the certainty of something felt rather than reasoned. He had been there. He had seen. Damien said nothing for a moment. Then, yes. You saw what happened. Yes. She looked at him across the table with her father's pen in her hand, and the divorce papers beside her elbow, and Miles Harlan very still in his chair, and she thought about the letter, and she thought about solid ground, and she thought about 9 weeks ago when Gavin had filed those papers while she was sleeping at this house, changing her father's medication schedule. And she thought about Eleanor Mercer setting the photograph face down with the glass cracking, and something inside her that had been bent for a very long time, not broken, bent, began very slowly to straighten. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "Nothing," Damien said. She watched his face. "What do you want from the trust?" "I have what the trust was protecting," he said. "That was already secured. I'm not here for the trust." "Then why?" "Because your father asked," he said simply, "and because what I watched in that cemetery this morning was something that should not have gone unaddressed." He said it without heat, without righteous anger, just with the flat, absolute quality of a conclusion reached. "The people who did that to you will understand shortly that there are consequences to certain choices." Miles cleared his throat. "There's also," he said carefully, "the matter of the succession paperwork, which needs to be executed before the end of the week, and which will require Ms. Whitmore's full attention and—" "Give her time to read it," Damien said, without looking at Miles. Miles closed the folder. The two of them looked at each other across the table. Naomi and Damien Viscari, the man who ran the most powerful criminal syndicate in the American Midwest, standing in her father's kitchen with his gloves in his hand and her father's pen in her hand, and 32 years of everything Arthur had built and hidden and protected filling the air between them like a weather system. "I don't know what I'm doing," Naomi said. "Not as a confession, as a fact." "You don't need to know yet," Damien said. "That's what the week is for." He picked up his gloves from where he'd set them. "Read everything Miles gives you. Read it carefully. Don't sign anything until you understand what you're signing." He moved toward the door. "I'll be in contact." He was almost through the door when Naomi said, "Mr. Vescari." He stopped. "Why did my father trust you?" The question sat in the air for a moment. Damien turned slightly. "He didn't, at first," he said. "That's how trust works. It takes time, and it takes situations, and it takes finding out what a man does when no one is watching and there's nothing to gain." He held her gaze for a moment. "He trusted me eventually because I showed him, over the course of about 4 years, that when I told him something was true, it was true. And when I told him I would do something, I did it." He looked at the pen in her hand. "He told me you were the same way," he said, "that you'd earned the right to be in that room by being that way your whole life without knowing there was a room." He left. The front door closed behind him. Naomi stood in the kitchen for a long moment. Through the window, she watched the 4 black SUVs move back down Cardwell Street with the same quiet inevitability with which they'd arrived. Then she sat down across from Miles Harlan, picked up the first document, and began to read. Outside in the street, Gavin Mercer's property developer friends had no idea that the woman they'd left kneeling in the mud at Oak Ridge Memorial Cemetery that morning had just inherited leverage over men who had run this city from behind velvet curtains for 3 generations. And somewhere in the distance, in a convoy of matte black vehicles moving through the gray Chicago morning, Damien Viscari was already making a phone call. The consequence was beginning. Miles Harlan left at 11:40 that night. He left 3 folders, a USB drive, a business card with 2 numbers on the back, and the specific instruction that Naomi was not to discuss the contents of the succession documents with anyone, not an attorney she hadn't vetted, not a friend, not a spouse, until the filing window closed at the end of the week. He said it without condescension, just with the flat clarity of a man who had watched people make irreversible mistakes in the first 72 hours of an inheritance and had learned that prevention was considerably less painful than damage control. Naomi locked the door behind him. She stood in the hallway for a moment with her back against the wood and the 3 folders on the kitchen table and her father's pen in her coat pocket and the divorce papers exactly where Gavin had left them, slightly crooked on the corner of the table, as though even in his absence he was refusing to straighten up after himself. She picked the divorce papers up. She read them this time. All 12 pages. She read the language about asset division, which was structured with the particular creativity of a document that has been drafted by someone who anticipated that the other party would be too overwhelmed to notice what was missing. She read the clause about the Cardwell Street property. Gavin's attorney had written it as though the house were already in probate, already resolved, already his to dispose of. She read the waiver language at the bottom of page 9, buried inside a paragraph about mutual release of claims that would have required her to sign away any rights to assets discovered within 12 months of the divorce date. Any assets discovered within 12 months. She set the papers down. She went to the kitchen and stood at the counter for a long moment, looking at the cracked photograph that she'd propped back up against the wall because she didn't have new glass for the frame yet. Arthur at 53. Herself at 9. His arm around her shoulders with the careful deliberateness of a man who was not naturally comfortable with physical affection, but who had understood on some level that the camera was recording something important. She picked up her phone and called the one number she hadn't called yet. It rang twice. "Ms. Whitmore," Miles said. He didn't sound like a man who had been asleep. "The asset waiver on page 9, she said. A pause. Brief. "Yes." He knew. "Mr. Mercer's attorney filed an inquiry with the probate court 2 days before your father passed," Miles said. "They were looking for asset disclosure. They didn't find anything because your father's structure was considerably more sophisticated than a standard estate. But yes, they knew something existed. They didn't know what." Naomi held the phone and looked at the cracked photograph. "Gavin brought those papers to my father's house 4 hours after the burial," she said. "I know. He was waiting." "Yes." She breathed out slowly through her nose. The anger was there. It had been building all day under the grief, the way a structural problem builds under a floor that still looks solid. But she wasn't going to use it carelessly. She'd watched her whole life what happened when people used anger carelessly. It became a weapon that cut its owner as much as anyone else. "I'm not signing them," she said. "No," Miles agreed. "You're not." She hung up. She didn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen table until 3 in the morning, reading every document in every folder, and when she was done, she read them again. And when she was done with that, she sat with a legal pad and wrote down everything she didn't understand and every question she needed answered. And by the time the gray Chicago morning started showing through the kitchen window, she had 4 pages of notes and the specific, grounded feeling of someone who has stopped being confused and started being dangerous. Gavin called at 9:15. "Did you sign?" "No," Naomi said. A silence that had texture to it, the silence of a man recalibrating. "Naomi, we talked about this." "You talked. I listened. I need this done before the end of the week. My attorney—" "Your attorney drafted a waiver on page 9 that would have signed away rights to assets discovered within 12 months of the divorce date," she said. "I'm curious about that." The silence this time was different, harder, more careful. "That's standard language," Gavin said. "Miles Harlan says it isn't. Miles Harlan works for your father's estate. He doesn't work for you." "As of 2 days ago, he does," Naomi said. "As of 2 days ago, a great many things are different, Gavin." "What does that mean?" "It means I'm not signing anything this week," she said. "It means I have questions that need answers before I put my name on a document your attorney spent considerable creative energy designing. You're being irrational." "I'm being thorough," she said. "There's a difference." She could hear him breathing, could hear in the quality of that breath the shift from the entitlement that came naturally to him into something tighter and more calculated. She'd lived with him for 4 years. She knew his frequencies. "I'm going to need you out of the Cardwell property by the end of the month," he said. "That property is part of the estate proceedings," she said. "Miles will be in touch with your attorney about the timeline." "Naomi, I have to go," she said. "I'll have someone contact you." She hung up. Her hands were steady. This surprised her. She'd expected them to shake, the way they always shook after a confrontation with Gavin, the way her body had always registered those interactions as threats, even when she'd been telling herself they were just conversations. But they were steady on the table in front of her, and her breathing was even, and she thought, this is what it feels like to have ground under your feet. The estate was 40 minutes outside the city, on the north shore of a private lake that Naomi had never known existed until Miles Harlan produced the deed and explained that Arthur had held it through a blind trust for 22 years. A man from Damien's organization, introduced only as Cal, mid-30s, with the compact quiet of someone trained to be unobtrusive in spaces he was actually controlling, drove her there that afternoon. He didn't make conversation. He drove with both hands on the wheel and his eyes moving between the road and the mirrors in a rhythm that was clearly habitual. And Naomi sat in the back seat and watched the city give way to suburbs, give way to the particular stillness of private lakefront property, and felt the disorientation of someone stepping into a life that had apparently been waiting for her without her knowledge. The house was older than she'd expected. Stone and timber, built into the landscape rather than imposed on it. The kind of architecture that had been expensive when it was built and had aged into something that transcended expense. The lake beyond it was still and very gray in the afternoon light. The trees around it were the kind of old that made the air underneath them feel different, cooler, slower, like the oxygen itself had been there longer. She stood at the front door with her overnight bag and looked at it. "Your father spent 2 weeks here every summer for the last decade," Cal said from beside the car. "He didn't tell you." "He told me he went to a faculty retreat," Naomi said. "He told a lot of people a lot of things," Cal said, without judgment. "The security system code is your birthday. He said it himself." She went inside. The house was full of Arthur. Not his things, not the books and papers and organized chaos of Cardwell Street, but something more essential than things. The way the rooms were arranged, the particular angle of the reading chair in the main room, positioned with precision to catch the afternoon light from the north window. The kitchen organized with the same functional logic, everything where it should be because it had been put there by someone who had thought about where it should be. She found his archive in the room behind the study. It was not a dramatic space. It was a room lined with gray steel filing cabinets and a single long table and a computer that was older than she expected, and a lamp that was positioned for exact utility. It was the room of a man who had understood that the most important things in his life needed to be protected through organization rather than ceremony. She spent 2 hours in that room. What she found in 2 hours would have taken most people 2 weeks to process. She moved through it methodically, folder by folder, the way Arthur had raised her to move through difficult material. Don't react yet. Understand first. React after. She found 30 years of financial architecture so sophisticated it read less like record-keeping and more like engineering. She found correspondence with names she recognized from news articles and names she didn't recognize, and names that she suspected she was better off not recognizing yet. She found evidence of the specific thing Miles had described, the stabilizing work, the interventions, the 11 days her father had spent constructing a framework that had prevented a war. And she found the cost of it, the personal cost, written in the careful margins of a man who had understood exactly what he was trading his private life for and had made that trade consciously. And she found a recording, a small digital file on a USB drive labeled in Arthur's handwriting, for Naomi. When she's ready. She was not ready. She plugged it in anyway. What? Arthur's face on the screen was thinner than she remembered. The recording was from 6 months ago, before the worst of the decline. But the weight of whatever he'd been carrying showed in the particular set of his jaw and the directness with which he looked at the camera, as though he were compensating for lost time through sheer eye contact. "Naomi," he said, "if you're watching this, then Miles has done his job and you've done yours, which means you've read everything and you're sitting in my archive trying to decide whether to be angry with me." She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Be angry," he said. "You've earned it. I kept things from you for 30 years, and I kept them for reasons I believed were good, and I believe that still, but I also know that believing your reasons are good doesn't exempt you from the consequences of the choices you make based on them." He paused. "I was protecting you. I was also protecting myself from a conversation I didn't know how to have. Both things were true. I was not always courageous in the ways that mattered most." Naomi's throat was very tight. "The world will measure you by the body they see," Arthur continued. "I watched that happen your whole life, and I didn't fight it the way I should have. I fought the internal version. I tried to teach you to know your own value, but I let the external version go unchallenged more times than I should have, because I told myself that resilience was more useful than defense. I was wrong about that. Resilience is what you build after the damage. Defense is what prevents it. I should have prevented more." She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth. "The trust is yours," Arthur said. "Not because you're my daughter, because you are the only person I have encountered in 30 years of watching people handle power who I genuinely believe will use it without being changed by it. That's not a small thing, Naomi. That is the rarest thing I know. He looked directly at the camera for a long moment. "Stop crying," he said, with the particular affectionate asperity she had heard her whole life and had spent her whole life pretending to be annoyed by. "There's work to do." The screen went dark. Naomi sat in the archive room with her father's fountain pen in her hand and didn't try to stop. The media found her on the third day. She didn't know how they got the story. Miles suspected a leak from the probate court, which meant Gavin's attorney had pushed on the right doors. But by Thursday morning, there were 2 vehicles outside the estate gate, and by Thursday afternoon, there were 6. And the headline that led the cycle was not about the trust or the succession or the 30-year history of Arthur Whitmore's actual work. It was about her body. Mafia-linked heiress. Who is the woman behind the billions? The photograph they used was from the cemetery. Someone had taken it without her knowing. She was kneeling in the mud beside Arthur's casket, her coat pulled across her shoulders, her weight visible in the specific way that photographs of certain women always manage to emphasize. The caption beneath it read, "Naomi Whitmore, 32, named sole heir to controversial trust with alleged organized crime connections." The second article was worse. A gossip platform, no byline, running quotes from anonymous sources. She recognized Gavin's cadence in 3 of them immediately. That described her as emotionally unstable, easily manipulated, a woman who had latched onto a dangerous man in her grief and was being used as a figurehead for a criminal organization that needed a sympathetic face. Sources close to this situation say Ms. Whitmore has shown signs of psychological dependency and may not be capable of making sound financial decisions independently. She read it twice. Then she set her phone face down on the table. Damien was in the room. He'd arrived that morning for a briefing with Miles about the succession filing timeline, and he was still there, standing near the window with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled to the forearm, reading something on his own phone with the contained focus he seemed to apply to everything equally. He looked up when she set the phone down. He looked at her face. "Show me," he said. She slid the phone across the table. He read it. His expression didn't change the way most people's expressions changed when they read something designed to make them angry. There was no flush, no jaw tightening, nothing theatrical. Just a very slight stillness, the kind of stillness that in certain animals indicates something other than calm. He set the phone down. "Mercer's attorney," he said. "I think so," Naomi said. "Pike's involved," he said. This was new. He said it the way you say something you've confirmed and don't want to sit on. "Roland Pike. He's been trying to locate your father's records for 4 years. He has 3 clients who have significant exposure in those files. Men who paid Arthur to manage information that they'd prefer stayed managed." He paused. "Gavin Mercer is not smart enough to run this alone. Someone connected him to Pike, probably through the attorney." "What does Pike want?" "Control of the archive," Damien said. "Not the money. The leverage. The files in that room are worth considerably more than the financial assets to the right people, because the financial assets can be disputed in court. The information in those files cannot be undisputed." Naomi looked at the phone, face down on the table. "They're going to come after me publicly," she said. "Keep pushing the instability narrative until you either retreat or make a mistake," Damien said. "Yes. What would retreating look like?" "Signing the divorce papers with the asset waiver, declining the succession, stepping back from the filing and allowing the trust to go into administrative limbo, at which point Pike's clients can challenge the structure through the courts and probably win." She sat with that for a moment. Outside the window, the lake was flat and gray and very still. A heron stood at the water's edge on the far bank, motionless, in the particular way of things that survive by being patient and striking at exactly the right moment. "If I sign the succession papers," she said, "there's no retreating from it." "No." "Pike's people will escalate." "Yes." "And the media will continue to be what it is," Damien said. "That part you cannot control. What you can control is what you do next." She looked at him. "Why does this matter to you?" she said. "Not my father. I understand my father. I mean this now, today. You don't need the trust. You have resources. You have protection. Why are you sitting in this house working through this with me instead of what?" he said. "I don't know. Whatever you would normally be doing. He considered the question with the same seriousness he seemed to apply to all questions, which she had noticed was not a quality common to men who had never needed to take things seriously. "Because the thing I watched in that cemetery," he said, "was a man deliberately step into a woman's path while she was burying her father, and everyone around her decided that was acceptable. And she stood up and walked away with more dignity than any of the people who just humiliated her, and she did it alone." He held her gaze. "I've spent my life in a world where power is taken from people who don't know they have it. Your father spent his life making sure you had it. Someone in that cemetery chose to step on it anyway." He picked up his jacket from the chair. "I don't do that," he said simply. "I don't walk past that." Gavin came to the estate gate that Friday afternoon. He didn't call first. He arrived in his own car for once, without Eleanor, which meant this was personal rather than strategic, which meant something had rattled him enough to move without planning. He leaned on the intercom with the specific pressure of a man who is used to pressure producing results. The security screen showed his face, slightly red, jaw tight, wearing a jacket with the collar turned up against the October cold in the way of a man who had dressed quickly and in agitation. Naomi was in the main room with Miles when Cal appeared in the doorway and told her. Damien was already at the security screen. Gavin's voice came through the speaker with a distortion that didn't quite flatten the anger in it. "I need to speak to my wife." "She's not available," Damien said. A pause, then, "Who is this?" "Someone who is standing between you and someone you no longer have standing to approach," Damien said. He said it without heat, which made it considerably more effective than heat would have been. "I'm her husband," Gavin said. "You're a man who left her in the mud," Damien said. "Those aren't the same thing." Through the screen, Naomi could see Gavin's face go through several things in rapid succession. Surprise, then a particular male fury at being answered in a register he hadn't anticipated, then something colder and more calculated. He was looking at the camera. He knew she was watching. Naomi. Directly to the camera, now. His voice shifted into the tone she knew. The intimate tone, the one that had once worked on her. The one that said, "It's just us. Forget the audience. Just you and me. I know you're watching. I know you're angry. I understand that. But you need to think about what you're doing. These people are dangerous. You don't understand what you're involved in. Whatever Vescari has told you about your father, about the trust, he has his own agenda." She looked at the screen. His face was doing the thing it did when he was frightened. The sincerity performance, the one that was very good, that had been the thing that made her trust him initially, because she hadn't yet learned that the most convincing sincerity performances come from people who have practiced them on someone more frightened than themselves. "I have always been the person who knew you," he said. "Not him, not Miles Harlan, me." Naomi walked to the security panel. She looked at his face on the screen for a long moment. "You filed those divorce papers 9 weeks before my father died," she said. "While I was in that house changing his medications and sleeping in the chair by his bed, you were already building the exit." Gavin opened his mouth. "You brought Vanessa to his funeral," she said. "You stepped into my path at his grave, Naomi, and you put a waiver on page 9 of a document you handed me 4 hours after I buried him that would have signed away rights to assets you already knew existed." Her voice was very even. "That's not a man who knew me. That's a man who was watching me and waiting for the right moment." His face changed. The sincerity performance dropped. Not slowly, all at once, like a mask that's been held up too long, and the muscles have given out. What was underneath it was something harder and more honest, angry, scared, both at once. "You're making a mistake," he said. "The gate's not opening," Damien said. Gavin stood at the intercom for a moment in the cold. Vanessa's car was visible at the edge of the frame, parked back on the access road. She hadn't come to the gate. She'd stayed back. That told Naomi something. Vanessa was calculating, always calculating, and she had calculated that this particular confrontation was not one to be visibly associated with. Gavin looked at the camera one more time. His expression had settled into something that was no longer personal. It was the expression of a man who has moved from wanting something to being willing to take it. "Tell your attorney to expect correspondence," he said. He got back in his car. Naomi watched the screen until his taillights disappeared down the access road. Then she turned to Miles. "How long do we have before he does something I can't contain through the filing?" she asked. Miles looked at his watch. The succession window closes in 72 hours. If you sign before then, the trust transfers, and any challenge has to go through the courts, which will take years, and which Pike's people cannot afford given the exposure in those files. And if I don't sign by then the trust goes into administrative review for 60 days, during which time the structure is vulnerable to legal challenge. The archive is potentially discoverable, and the people whose information your father was protecting become considerably more motivated to act. Naomi thought about that. She thought about her father saying she'll want to refuse. Don't let her refuse for the wrong reasons. And she thought about the difference between refusing because you're afraid and refusing because you understand what you're walking into. The first was retreat. The second was strategy. She picked up the succession document from the table. She read the first page again. I need one more night, she said. You have it, Miles said. She took the document to the archive room and sat down at Arthur's long table under Arthur's lamp and read every page again from the beginning, making notes in the margins in her own handwriting beside Arthur's. 2 generations of the same methodical mind working through the same problem. Outside, the lake went dark as the evening came in. She was 3 pages from the end when her phone buzzed. It was a number she didn't recognize. Chicago area code, no name. She answered. The voice on the other end was male, smooth, with the particular professional warmth of a man who makes difficult calls for a living. Ms. Whitmore, he said, my name is Roland Pike. I think it's time we spoke directly, before this becomes something neither of us can manage. The archive room was very quiet. Naomi held the phone and looked at her father's handwriting in the margins of the file in front of her and thought, very clearly and without panic, that her father had been absolutely right. She had no idea how deep this went. And she was about to find Naomi did not hang up. This was the first decision, and it was the right one. And she made it in the half-second between recognizing the name and the instinct to end the call. She pressed that instinct flat and held the phone and breathed and said nothing, because saying nothing was information too, and she wanted to know what Roland Pike would do with silence before she gave him anything else. He let it sit for 4 seconds. Then, I'll take that as an invitation to continue. I haven't invited you to do anything, Naomi said. Fair. His voice was the kind of professional warmth that gets built over years of making people feel heard while taking things from them. I'll be direct then. I've been trying to locate your father's archive for 4 years, not to destroy it. That would be counterproductive for everyone, including me. To manage it, to ensure that the information in those files is handled with the discretion your father applied to it. My father's discretion involved not telling anyone where the files were. Your father's discretion was impeccable, Pike said, which is exactly why his death creates a problem. The people whose information is in those files have spent years trusting that Arthur Whitmore's judgment was the only variable they needed to account for. Now the variable is you, and with respect, Ms. Whitmore, they don't know you. Then they should introduce themselves, she said, through their attorneys, properly. Some of them will, Pike said. Some of them are not the kind of men who use attorneys when they're frightened. She heard it clearly, the frame shift, from consultation to threat, done so smoothly that it almost sounded like concern. Is that what this is? She said. A warning? It's a conversation, Pike said. One I'd rather have before the 72-hour window closes and before decisions get made that are difficult to walk back. A pause. I have a proposal that protects you financially, removes you from a position of considerable danger, and ensures that the people in those files remain cooperative. Cooperative. Toward you, your ongoing safety, your future. Naomi looked at her father's handwriting in the margin of the document in front of her. A note from 3 years ago, written in the specific shorthand Arthur used when he was thinking through something dangerous. R. Pike. Escalation risk. Containment strategy necessary. Do not negotiate directly. She had not known, until this moment, that the note was about an actual person. She had been holding the answer in her hands for 20 minutes. I'll need to think about it, she said. Of course, Pike said. I'll call tomorrow, before noon. He hung up. She sat in the archive room for exactly 60 seconds, doing nothing. Then she went to find Damien. He was in the main room, still awake, in the chair by the window with a glass of water on the table beside him and his jacket back on, which told her he hadn't been planning to sleep. Cal was somewhere in the house. She could hear, very faintly, the specific silence of someone trained to move without sound, trying to stay out of the way. She told Damien about the call. She told him everything, word for word, the way Arthur had trained her to report. No editorializing, no interpretation yet, just the sequence of what was said. When she was done, she put her phone on the table between them and watched his face. He was quiet for a moment. "He knows about the 72 hours, Damien said. "Yes. Which means he has someone inside the probate filing system, or inside Miles's office." She hadn't gotten that far yet. She felt it land. The specific cold of understanding that the perimeter she'd been operating inside was not as intact as she'd believed. "Miles," she said. "Not Miles," Damien said, and his certainty was immediate and complete. "Miles Harlan has been protecting your father's interests for 29 years. If he were compromised, Pike wouldn't need to call you. He'd already have what he needs." He picked up his phone. "One of Miles's staff, or the court clerk on the filing. Either way, we move the timeline." "What does that mean?" "It means you sign tonight," Damien said. Not tomorrow, tonight. We file electronically before midnight, we close the window, and we remove Pike's leverage over the timing." Naomi looked at the succession document on the table. 3 pages from the end. Her notes in the margins, her father's notes beneath hers. She thought about the word cooperative and the specific way Pike had shaped it. Not a description of behavior, but a category of arrangement. The kind that required ongoing payments or ongoing silence or ongoing access. The kind that dressed itself in the language of mutual benefit and functioned as a very elegant trap. She picked up the pen. She finished reading the last 3 pages in 12 minutes. Then she signed. And Miles arrived at the estate at 11:15, summoned by a call from Damien that had lasted 40 seconds. He filed the succession electronically at 11:51, with 9 minutes remaining in the window, and he did it from Arthur's archive room on Arthur's old computer, with Naomi standing behind him and Damien standing in the doorway, and the specific quiet of people who understand that the thing happening in front of them is irreversible. The confirmation came at 11:53. Miles printed it, placed it on the table, looked at it for a moment with the expression of a man who has been working towards something for a very long time and is now looking at the proof that it is done. "Your father would have," he started. "Don't," Naomi said. Not unkindly. Miles nodded, closed the laptop. He left at midnight. Naomi stood in the archive room alone for a moment after he was gone. She held the signed confirmation, and she felt, not triumph, nothing as clean as that, but something closer to the specific exhaustion of a person who has been holding a structure upright through sheer effort and has finally set it down in a place that can hold its own weight. She went to bed. She slept 4 hours, which was more than she'd expected. Pike called at 8 the next morning. She let it go to voicemail. He called again at 8:45. She listened to the voicemail while she was standing in Arthur's kitchen making coffee. His voice had changed. The professional warmth was still there, but it was thinner now, stretched over something that she recognized as the controlled anger of a man who has discovered that the move he was counting on has already been made without him. "Ms. Whitmore, I think you've made a decision without fully understanding the context. I'd like an opportunity to provide that context before things become complicated. Please call me back." She deleted it. Damien was at the kitchen table. He'd been there when she came down with coffee already made, which she suspected meant he also had not slept much. He looked at her face when she set the phone down. "He called," he said. "Voicemail," she said. "He knows." "He knew within an hour of the filing," Damien said, "which confirms the leak inside the court system." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "He'll move differently now, less patience. The media pressure will increase. Expect something in the afternoon cycle, probably another story about your stability or about my involvement with the trust, something designed to make the filing look coerced." "Can they challenge the filing on those grounds?" "They can try," Damien said. "It won't hold, but it creates noise, and noise creates doubt, and doubt creates the conditions for the kind of pressure they prefer." She sat down across from him. Outside, the lake was very still in the early morning light. The heron was back on the far bank, same position, same patience. "Tell me about Pike," she said. Damien looked at her for a moment with the assessing quality she'd noticed before. Not distrust, More like someone calibrating how much of a particular truth a particular person needs right now versus how much they can use. He's a fixer, Damien said. The kind your father was not. He moves information as a commodity, buys leverage, sells it, manages it. He's been trying to get access to your father's archive because 3 of his highest value clients have exposure in those files. Evidence of financial crimes that your father documented as part of his stabilizing work, never intending to use it, just holding it as insurance against the situations getting worse. But Pike would use it. Pike would sell it, Damien said. To the right prosecutors, the right journalists, the right competing interests. Arthur's archive in Pike's hands becomes a weapon. In yours, it stays what your father intended, a balance of power, a reason for dangerous men to stay in their lanes. Naomi thought about that, about the difference between holding information and wielding it, about what it meant to inherit a position that derived its power entirely from restraint. The 3 clients, she said. Who are they? Damien told her. She recognized 2 of the names. One was a state senator from Illinois who had been a reliable presence in Chicago political coverage for 12 years. The other was the chairman of a private equity firm whose name appeared regularly in the financial press as a model of legitimate institutional investment. The third name she didn't recognize. The third one, she said. Damien's expression changed, very slightly, but she was learning to read very slight. The third one is more complicated, he said. How complicated? He set down the coffee cup. The third client, Damien said carefully, is someone who had a relationship with your father that I didn't know about until 2 days ago when I started pulling on the threads around Pike's network. He paused. His name is Victor Crane. He's been operating in the Chicago financial sector for 20 years under a corporate identity that is entirely legitimate on the surface. Underneath it, he runs a debt collection and enforcement operation that has been, another pause, more deliberate, financing Gavin Mercer's property portfolio for the last 3 years. The kitchen was very quiet. Naomi heard the coffee maker finishing its cycle. Gavin's business is funded by one of Pike's clients, she said. Yes? Which means when Gavin found out about the trust, he told Crane, Damien said. And Crane told Pike. And the reason Gavin moved so fast with the divorce papers, the reason there was a waiver on page 9, the reason the filing timeline was leaked to Pike, Gavin was working for them, Naomi said. The sentence came out very flat. She heard it leave her mouth, and it landed on the kitchen table between them like something dropped from a significant height. Not explosive, just final. The kind of truth that doesn't announce itself with drama because it doesn't need to. She sat with it. 4 years. 4 years of a marriage that she had known, on some cellular level, was wrong, but that she had stayed in because she had convinced herself that the wrongness was her fault, her weight, her intensity, her inability to be easier, lighter, less. 4 years of managing herself smaller so that she fit into a space that had never actually been designed for her. And the man who had defined that space had been, for at least 3 of those 4 years, a financial instrument of the people who wanted her father's archive. He married me before he knew about the trust, she said, needing to establish that, needing to know where the calculation had started. Yes, Damien said. He married you before. Crane approached him about 2 years in when your father's name came up in the context of one of Crane's debt recovery operations. Gavin put it together, who Arthur was, what he held, who you were in relation to it, and he made a choice. He stayed, Naomi said. He stayed and reported back, Damien said, waiting for your father to die, waiting for the succession to move, waiting for a moment when you'd be isolated and overwhelmed enough to sign whatever was put in front of you. She thought about 9 weeks before Arthur's death. Gavin filing the divorce papers while she slept in the chair beside her father's hospital bed. She had thought that was cruelty, simple and personal. It was that, but it was also operational. He'd been creating legal groundwork for asset access before she had any reason to protect herself. She thought about Eleanor at the grave. You couldn't even lose weight for your father's funeral. She thought about the photograph face down on the counter, the cracked glass. She thought about the mud. He told them about the funeral, she said. He told them when it was, made sure it was public enough. The media story about the cemetery photograph, someone leaked that image within 6 hours. That was Crane's communications team, Damien said. setting the narrative. Unstable woman, grieving, physically vulnerable, falling under mafia influence. They needed that story established before the succession filing so that if you did sign, it could be challenged as coercion. Naomi stood up from the table. She walked to the kitchen window and stood with her back to Damien and looked at the lake and breathed. In through the nose, out slowly, the way you breathe when you are trying to keep a particular feeling from becoming a particular action. Her hands were shaking now, finally. Everything she'd managed to keep still for 3 days was moving now, and she let it move because there was nothing useful in fighting it, and she stood at the window and shook and breathed and looked at the absolutely indifferent stillness of the water and waited for it to pass. It took a while. When she turned back around, her face was dry, and her voice was level, and something in her eyes had changed. Not hardened exactly, but clarified, the way a lens clarifies when it finds the right distance from what it's trying to see. "Where's Crane now?" she said. "Chicago. He has an office in the River North Financial District, a residence in Lincoln Park. He's not hiding. He doesn't think I'm a threat yet." "No," Damien said. "He thinks you're a grieving woman who signed a document under pressure from me, and that the filing will be challenged and overturned within 60 days, and that the archive will be accessible through the legal process, and that Gavin will cooperate with the challenge in exchange for whatever Crane is holding over him." "What is Crane holding over Gavin?" "Holding over $12 million in debt," Damien said. "Gavin's portfolio is leveraged to the point of collapse. Crane owns the notes. If Crane calls them, Gavin loses everything within 90 days. Naomi sat back down. She thought about Gavin at the estate gate, the mask dropping, the expression underneath it that was anger and fear at the same time. She thought about Vanessa staying back at the car, calculating. She thought about the tell your attorney to expect correspondence, not rage, a position. A man who had been told what move to make next and was making it. "He's not acting alone," she said. "He's being managed." "Yes." "Which means the correspondence his attorney sends will be designed by Crane." "Yes." "And the media cycle, also Crane," Damien said. "He has 2 journalists in his pocket. The stories about your stability, about your body, about my alleged coercion, those are structured to create a public record that supports the legal challenge." She understood, fully and completely, the architecture of what had been built around her. Not randomly cruel, deliberately engineered. A structure designed with her specific vulnerabilities as load-bearing elements. Her grief, her isolation, her history of accepting what was put in front of her and managing herself into whatever shape the room required. Arthur had seen this coming. "She'll want to refuse. Don't let her refuse for the wrong reasons." He had known there would be people who'd move against her. He'd built the trust, the archive, the succession structure to give her the tools to survive it. But he hadn't been able to tell her while he was alive, because telling her would have meant explaining everything, and explaining everything meant exposing her to danger before she had the position to defend against it. He'd given her the armor first. She'd just put it on. And now the people who'd been counting on her never getting there were in motion. The story broke at 2 in the afternoon. It wasn't the stability narrative this time. It was worse. The headline ran on a financial news platform with a national readership and a reputation for sourced reporting that made it considerably more damaging than the previous gossip pieces. Whitmore Trust succession. Questions emerge about filing circumstances. Sources allege duress. She read it on her phone standing in the archive room. It was 6 paragraphs long and every paragraph was precisely constructed. Anonymous legal sources questioning the circumstances of the signing, unnamed parties withstanding to challenge the succession, carefully hedged language about undue influence that stopped just short of libel while communicating exactly what it intended to communicate. The final paragraph noted that Damien Viscari had been present at the estate during the filing and referenced his organization's history with federal investigations, and placed that fact next to Naomi's recent inheritance with the studied neutrality of a piece that had been written by someone who understood exactly how juxtaposition worked. She called Miles. "I've seen it," he said before she could speak. "How bad?" "It creates noise," Miles said. "The filing is sound. I'm confident in that. But if this reaches the right judge with the right sympathies and Crane's attorneys are as well prepared as I suspect they are, there's a version of this where the challenge gets traction." A pause. "I need to know if there is anything in the circumstances of the signing that could be characterized as pressure." Anything Viscari said or did that, he told me to sign tonight instead of tomorrow, Naomi said, because we'd identified a leak in the filing timeline. That's all. That's all? That's all, Miles. Then we're in a defensible position, he said. But defensible is not the same as safe. We need the challenge addressed before it builds momentum. How do we address it? We go public, Miles said. Not the Crane connection. Not yet, that's a separate proceeding. But your story. Your own account of the succession, your relationship to the trust, your father's work. We take the narrative off the table by filling it ourselves. Naomi thought about being public. She thought about what public had looked like for the last 3 days. The photographs, the comments, the word instability placed next to her image and left there to do its work. They'll use it, she said. Whatever I say, they'll use it. Yes, Miles said, but right now they're using your silence. At least a statement gives you the frame. She looked at the archive room around her, her father's filing cabinets, his lamp, the confirmation of the succession on the table in front of her with her signature on the last page. Set it up, she said. Not an interview. A statement. I'll write it myself. She spent 2 hours writing it. She rewrote it 4 times. She stripped out everything that sounded like defense and kept only what was true. And by the time she was done, it was 800 words, and it was the clearest thing she had ever written, and it frightened her in the specific way that clarity frightens people who have spent a long time being deliberately unclear about themselves. She sent it to Miles at 5:15. At 5:47, a different call came in. Not Pike this time. Vanessa. Naomi almost didn't answer. Then she did, because Vanessa staying back at the car had registered as calculation, and calculation meant information, and right now information was the most valuable thing available. I need to tell you something, Vanessa said. Her voice was different, the careful social tone gone, something raw underneath it that Naomi hadn't heard before and hadn't expected. About Gavin. About what Crane told him to do. Naomi held very still. Why? She said. Because Crane told Gavin 3 weeks ago that if the succession filing went through and the archive stayed protected, the exposure in those files would be used against Crane's competitors, Vanessa said, including a man named Soto. Crane's people have been taking Soto's operation apart for 2 years. Soto knows. And Soto has decided that the fastest way to neutralize the threat from that archive— She stopped. Vanessa, Naomi said, is to remove the person who controls it. The archive room was very quiet. Outside, the lake had gone dark. There's going to be an attempt, Vanessa said. Not legal, not through the media, Soto's people. Crane doesn't know Soto's moved on it yet. He's going to be as surprised as you are, which means his protection isn't— The line went dead. Not disconnected. Cut. The specific, abrupt silence of a call ended by something other than a choice. Naomi looked at the phone in her hand. Then she was on her feet and moving through the archive room toward the main house, and she was calling Damien before she cleared the doorway, and the phone rang twice, and then his voice came through and she said very clearly, without any of the composure she'd been building for 4 days, Someone's coming to the estate, Naomi said. Tonight. Damien was already moving. She could hear it. The specific quality of sound that comes through a phone when the person on the other end has shifted from still to kinetic. The background noise changing texture. Voices in another room responding to something he said that she couldn't catch. How long ago did the call cut? He said. 30 seconds? Where are you? Archive room doorway. Stay there. Don't go to any exterior window. Cal. This last word not to her. To someone in the room with him, sharp and immediate. Then back to her. I'm 4 minutes out. I left an hour ago to handle something in the city. I'm already turning around. Vanessa said Soto's people. She said Crane doesn't know. I know who Soto is, Damien said. The flatness in his voice when he said the name was different from his usual flatness. Denser, like something compressed. He's been looking for a reason to move on the archive for 18 months. He just found one. A pause filled with road noise. Cal has 3 men on the property. They're good. Go to the interior hallway, the one without windows, and stay there until I'm through the gate. What about Vanessa? Vanessa made a choice, he said. We deal with that after. Go. She went. Thus, The interior hallway of the estate ran between the archive room and the kitchen, windowless, with stone walls that had been part of the original construction and that held the cold of the lake in them even in October. Naomi stood against the left wall with her back to the stone and her phone in her hand and listened to the house. She could hear Cal moving. He was good. She'd clocked, over the past 3 days, just how good he was at being present without being visible, but now the quality of his movement had changed from background management to something deliberate and directional. She heard him on the stairs, heard a door close on the upper floor, heard very faintly the radio crackle of communication between his men outside. She thought about the blueprint. This was the thing that surfaced, clear and specific, out of the noise of her own heartbeat, the estate blueprint. Arthur had walked her through it on a Tuesday afternoon when she was 11 years old during what she had understood at the time as one of his characteristically purposeless educational exercises. Here is how a structure works. Here is why rooms are placed where they are. Here is the logic of a building designed before modern construction methods. He'd made her memorize the load-bearing walls, the original drainage layout, the 3 maintenance passages that had been incorporated into the stone structure and then walled over during a renovation in the 1990s. She had not known, at 11, that this was preparation. She knew now. The nearest maintenance passage was behind the kitchen wall, accessed through a panel that looked like a section of original stone, but that moved on a pivot when you applied pressure to the upper right corner. It ran southeast, under the house, and came up in the groundskeeper's building 60 yards from the main structure. From the groundskeeper's building, there was a clear line of sight to the lake access road and the eastern gate. She was not going to use it yet, but she was going to know where it was. She moved to the kitchen end of the hallway and found the panel and pressed the upper right corner until she felt the mechanism engage, a low stone grinding give, like the building clearing its throat. She pushed it an inch open. Cold air and the smell of old drainage and stone dust. She left it an inch open and went back to the wall and waited. Damien came through the front door at 3 minutes and 40 seconds. She knew it was him by the way the door opened. Not cautious, not announcing itself, just purposeful. She came out of the hallway and he was already in the main room with his jacket gone and his sleeves down and his eyes doing the thing they did when he was fully operational, moving through the space with the comprehensive attention of someone building a real-time map. 2 vehicles on the lake access road, Cal said from the top of the stairs. Parked. No movement yet. We count 4 bodies, possibly more. Soto doesn't send 4 people for a conversation, Damien said. No, sir. Damien looked at Naomi, really looked at her the way he had in the cemetery. The full assessment, nothing withheld. Are you all right? I know the maintenance passage, she said, behind the kitchen wall. My father made me memorize the blueprint when I was 11. Something moved in his face. Not surprise. Something quieter than surprise, more like recognition. Can you access the groundskeeper's building from it without going above ground? Yes. The archive, he said. If they breach the main structure, the archive is the target. They don't want you hurt. He said it carefully, not as reassurance but as tactical information. Soto needs the succession challenged, not a murder investigation. But the archive is a different calculation. If the archive burns, the succession stands, the filing is already done, Damien said. But the leverage goes. The information your father held, the balance that's kept those men in their lanes, that's gone with it, which is exactly what Soto wants. Then we protect the archive, Naomi said. We protect you first. I'm telling you I know this building, she said. I'm not telling you that so you can put me in a room. I'm telling you because it's useful. He looked at her for a moment. The house was very quiet around them. The particular quiet of a space where everyone inside it is managing their breathing. All right, he said. He told her the plan in 40 seconds flat. Clean, sequential, no wasted language. Cal and his 2 exterior men would hold the eastern approach. Damien's driver, who had come back with him and was currently at the north perimeter, would cover the gate. If the vehicles moved before they'd confirmed the full count, Naomi would go through the maintenance passage to the groundskeeper's building with the archive's backup drive, a USB that Miles had given her containing encrypted copies of the critical files, and wait there until Cal gave the all clear. What's the backup drive's encryption? She said. Damien almost smiled. 14-character key. Miles has it. You have it. I don't. Good, she said. She went to the archive room and pulled the backup drive from the drawer where Miles had left it, and she put it in the inside pocket of her jacket, and she stood for a moment looking at Arthur's filing cabinets and Arthur's lamp and the confirmation of the succession on the table with her signature on the last page, and she thought, not tonight. Then the lights went out. Check. Not a power failure. A cut. Instantaneous. Total. The specific darkness of something deliberately done. The estate's security system had a 30-second battery backup that should have triggered emergency lighting along the lower floor, and for 3 seconds she waited for it, and it didn't come, which meant they'd cut the backup too, which meant someone had done reconnaissance on this building before tonight, which meant this had been planned longer than Vanessa's call suggested. She had her phone, screen off. She moved by memory. Archive room to hallway, 14 steps, left hand on the stone wall. The hallway was colder than the main rooms. She felt the temperature shift on her face before her hand found the corner. She moved to the kitchen end and found the panel and pushed it fully open and went through. The maintenance passage was exactly as her father had described it 30 years ago. Low-ceilinged, stone-floored, with a slight downward grade that ran southeast. She had to move bent slightly forward. The cold air moved against her face in a way that told her the passage still breathed, still connected to the outside, which meant it hadn't been sealed in the intervening years. She turned her phone screen on for 3 seconds, enough to confirm the passage was clear ahead, then off. She moved. Above her she could hear through the stone and the floor the sounds of the estate responding to its own emergency. She heard something impact the front door. Not a knock, a ram, a tool, or a body used with force. She heard Cal's voice, sharp and stripped to pure communication. She heard, and this hit her chest like a physical thing, a single gunshot from the eastern perimeter, then 2 more in rapid succession. She kept moving. The passage ran 60 yards. She counted her steps in groups of 10, the way Arthur had told her to count in darkness. Groups, not singles, because singles make you lose track. Groups give you a rhythm. She was on her 4th group when she heard, somewhere behind her in the main structure, glass breaking. Then feet on the stone floor above, more than 2 people, moving fast. She did not run. Running in the dark in an unfamiliar passage with a low ceiling would put her on the floor, and on the floor she was done. She moved as fast as she could move without running, which was faster than most people would have managed, and she counted and breathed and kept her left hand on the wall. At step 58 of the passage ended in a wooden door that had swollen in its frame from years of disuse. She hit it with her shoulder. Once, it gave slightly. Twice, it stuck. 3 times she put her full weight behind it, and it opened outward with a sound like a gunshot of its own, and cold night air came at her face, and she was in the groundskeeper's building, dark and smelling of old oil and metal tools, and she pulled the door shut behind her and found the wall and stood against it with her heart going hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. She waited. She counted to 30. She turned her phone on, screen brightness all the way down, and found the small window on the east wall of the building, at knee height, that looked back toward the main estate. The estate's exterior security lights were gone. The main structure was dark. She could see movement, shapes, not details, near the eastern entrance. She could see on the lake access road the 2 vehicles that Cal's men had clocked, and beside them, on the ground, something she didn't let herself look at directly. Then she saw the 3rd vehicle. It hadn't been there when Cal had counted. It had come in from the south, from the secondary access point that Arthur had told her about at 11 years old, and that she had told no one about because no one had asked. A fire access road that ran along the back of the property, more overgrown than maintained, invisible from the main gate's camera positioning. 3 people got out of the 3rd vehicle. She turned her phone off. She understood, in the dark of the groundskeeper's building, that the count had been wrong from the beginning. The 2 vehicles on the lake access road had been deliberate. A number Cal's team could manage, a number that looked like the real threat. The 3rd vehicle was the actual movement, and the man who got out of the passenger seat of the 3rd vehicle, even in the dark, even at 60 yards, moved with the particular economy of someone who is present to supervise rather than participate. Soto had come himself. She turned her phone on for 2 seconds, enough time to send a single text to Damien. 3rd vehicle south access. Soto direct, then off. She heard the groundskeeper's building door open from the main estate side, not the maintenance passage door. She had pulled that shut. The other door, the regular entrance, the one that faced the main house. It opened with the particular careful slowness of someone who isn't sure what's on the other side. She pressed flat against the wall beside the window. A flashlight beam cut across the space in front of her. Wide sweep, then narrow, then floor level. She kept her breathing shallow and controlled and looked at the moving light and did not move. The beam stopped. It pointed at the maintenance passage door. The person holding it, one person, she was almost certain, the footfall pattern was single, moved toward it. They were checking the passage. They'd found it, which meant they had a blueprint too, which confirmed the reconnaissance. She had 4 seconds before they established that the passage had been recently used. She was across the building in 3 and hit the regular door from the inside with her shoulder and came out into the night air at a run, heading southeast, away from the main structure, toward the lake edge where the tree line came down close to the water. And she heard behind her the shout of someone who had expected to find a door and found a person instead. She ran. Her heels were wrong for this, low, but still heeled, and the ground between the groundskeeper's building and the tree line was uneven, frosted grass over rough soil, and she felt her ankle turn slightly on the second step and corrected without stopping and kept moving because stopping was not a calculation she was making right now. The lake was to her right, very close. She could smell it, cold water and late-season reeds. And the trees were ahead and she was breathing in the loud, ungainly way of someone who is not a runner operating beyond their comfortable range. And she heard pursuit behind her, 2 sets of feet, and she thought about the archive drive in her jacket pocket and moved faster. She hit the tree line. The undergrowth grabbed at her ankles and she went down onto one knee. The same knee, she registered distantly, that had gone into the mud at Oak Ridge Memorial Cemetery. And she caught herself on both hands on the frozen ground and came back up without stopping. In the dark, the trees were close enough together that a straight-line pursuit was impossible. She moved laterally, south along the water, one hand out to feel the trees passing, counting by touch. The pursuit sound split. One set stayed closer to the estate, one came into the trees. Single pursuer then. She could work with single. She found a trunk wide enough and put it between herself and the sound, and stopped. Waited. The pursuer moved through the trees with less caution than she expected, which meant either less training or more confidence in catching her, and she filed this information. She could hear them breathing. They were close. 8 feet, maybe 10. She stayed still. 7 seconds of nothing. Then the flashlight came on, sweeping, and caught the right side of her face for a fraction of a second before she moved behind the trunk. And she heard the pursuer reorient and come toward her, and she was already moving again, further south. And the ground dropped away suddenly, and she was sliding down a short embankment onto the frozen mud at the actual lake edge, and she caught the last tree before the water with both hands and stopped herself and turned. The pursuer came down the embankment after her. She didn't have a weapon. She had the trunk at her back and the water 6 inches behind her heels, and the archive drive in her jacket, and 4 years of being told she was too much for every room she'd ever been in. She had her size, which she had spent her entire adult life apologizing for. She stopped apologizing. The pursuer was male, heavier than her, came down the embankment with the forward momentum of someone who'd expected more of a chase than this, and she stepped left off the tree trunk as he reached the bottom, and he went past her by his own velocity, and one foot hit the frozen mud at the lake edge and slipped, and she caught his jacket collar with both hands and used his own momentum and the angle of the bank to put him down sideways on the mud, hard enough that the air went out of him audibly. She was moving before he'd finished falling. Back up the embankment, into the trees. North, back toward the estate. Her hands were shaking badly now. Adrenaline debt, the body calling in what it's owed. She gripped the nearest tree for 3 seconds and breathed and let the shaking run through her and come out the other side, and when it had, she moved again. She came out of the tree line 50 yards north of where she'd entered it, and the estate was in front of her, and the situation had changed. The lights were back. Not the main estate lights, different lights, vehicle lights, 4 sets of them, and she recognized one of the vehicles as Damien's and understood that the cavalry had arrived, and that the timeline of the past 8 minutes had been considerably shorter than it had felt from inside it. She could see figures near the eastern entrance, Damien's people. She could read their positioning, their facing. She could see, near the third vehicle from the south access road, a situation that was in the process of resolving itself in a direction that was not good for Soto. She walked out of the tree line. Cal saw her first. He said something into his radio, and she saw Damien's head come up and turn toward her. and he crossed the ground between them at a pace that was not quite a run, but was the thing just before a run, the thing a man does when he is managing the impulse to run, because running would tell people something he is not prepared to tell them. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her, at the mud on her knee, at her hands, at her face. "The passage," he said. "Someone found it," she said. "I came out the other door, ran for the tree line." She was still breathing hard. "I put one of them down at the lake edge. He'll be all right, probably." Something in Damien's face went through a rapid sequence of things she didn't have the bandwidth to catalog right now. "The drive," he said. She put her hand to her jacket pocket, felt the USB through the fabric. "Here." He looked at her for another second. "Soto," she said. "Where is he?" Damien turned. Near the third vehicle, in the wash of the headlights, a man was sitting against the rear wheel. Not injured, contained. Damien's driver stood over him with the patient stillness of someone who is very comfortable with this particular arrangement. Soto was perhaps 55, heavier than his frame suggested, with the kind of face that had once been striking and had settled into authority the way authority settles into faces that have never been seriously challenged. He was looking at Naomi, not at Damien, at her. She walked toward him. Damien moved with her. She stopped 3 feet from Soto and looked down at him, and waited. "You're not what I expected," Soto said. His voice was even, the voice of a man who has been in worse positions and knows it. "No," Naomi said. "I'm not." "The archive," he said, "whatever's in those files about my operation is exactly as accessible to prosecutors as it was yesterday," she said. "The succession is filed. The archive is protected. Nothing that happened tonight changes that." "Then what was the point?" he said. Not hostiles, a genuine question, tactical inventory. "You made a calculation," she said, "that I was the weakest point in this structure, that I could be frightened out of the position before I understood what it was." She kept her voice level. "You were wrong about the weakest point." Soto looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Damien. "She's not what you expected either," he said. Damien said nothing. "The files," Soto said. "I need to know what your father documented." "Then you need to go through the proper channel," Naomi said, "which is Miles Harlan's office with an attorney during business hours." She held his eyes, the same as everyone else, as Soto sat against the wheel of his own vehicle in the light of the headlamps and looked at the woman standing over him in a mud-kneed jacket with her father's archive drive in her pocket, and something in his face shifted. Not respect exactly, but the thing that comes just before respect in men who have only ever had to extend it at gunpoint. Then, from the direction of the main estate, Gavin Mercer came through the eastern entrance. He was not running. He was walking with his hands partially raised, escorted by one of Cal's men, and he was looking at the ground and his face was white in the headlamp wash, and he was wearing the expression of a man who has just watched every calculation he's made for 3 years collapse in real time. He looked up. He saw Naomi. He stopped walking. She looked at him across the space between them, across the floodlit ground with Soto against the wheel to her left, and Damien beside her and the cold lake air moving through the space between the trees and the estate. And she felt, not anger anymore, something beyond anger, something quieter and more total, the specific feeling of a woman who has finally stopped trying to make sense of how she was treated and has simply decided that Gavin stopped walking because there was nowhere left to go. That was the simple truth of it. He stood in the floodlit ground between Cal's man and the eastern entrance of the estate with his hands half raised and his face the color of old concrete, and there was simply no direction available to him that wasn't already covered. He understood this. She could see him understanding it, the rapid internal inventory of a man who has spent 3 years building exits and has just discovered that every one of them has been closed. He looked at Naomi. She walked toward him. Damien stayed where he was. This was deliberate. She felt him make the choice to stay, felt the absence of his footstep behind her as a kind of permission. He understood that this particular conversation was not his. She stopped 4 feet from Gavin. She looked at him for a long moment without speaking. She was aware of her own breathing, steadier than it should have been, given the last 40 minutes. Steadier than it had ever been in 4 years of standing in a room with this man and trying to take up exactly the right amount of space. "Crane told you to be here tonight," she said. Gavin's jaw moved. I came to... Don't, she said. I'm not asking for an explanation. I'm telling you what I know, so you understand what the next conversation with your attorney is going to look like. She kept her voice level. Crane sent you here. You have been communicating information about the trust, about the succession timeline, about this property's layout to Roland Pike's network for at least 14 months. The asset waiver on page 9 of the divorce papers was drafted in direct consultation with Crane's legal team. And the photograph from my father's grave, the one that ran in the media within 6 hours of the burial, was provided by someone in Crane's communications operation who you gave access to. Gavin said nothing. The question I have, she said, is whether you knew what tonight was supposed to be. A long silence. I didn't know about Soto, he said finally. His voice was different, the performance register entirely gone, what was underneath it thin and tired and younger sounding than she'd expected. I knew Pike was going to make a move on the archive. I didn't know Soto was involved. Crane didn't tell me about Soto. Because Crane didn't know, she said. No. She looked at him. At the face she had woken up beside for 4 years, the face she had at various points believed in completely and at other points managed the distance from and at the end simply endured. It was not a villainous face. That was the thing she kept arriving at, the thing that didn't have a clean resolution. It was just the face of a man who had chosen badly, repeatedly, and had dressed each bad choice in the language of practicality until he'd forgotten that language wasn't the same as truth. You married me before you knew about the trust, she said. Yes. And when you found out, I stayed, he said. And then, with the specific shame of someone who knows the next sentence is worse, I stayed for the wrong reason. I know, she said. She looked at him for one more moment. Your debt to Crane, she said. 12 million. He flinched. The number landing to being spoken aloud by her, of all people, produced something in his face that was close to physical pain. The archive contains documentation of Crane's enforcement operation, she said, including the debt instruments he uses to control people, including yours. She held his eyes. When this goes through the appropriate legal channels, and it will, all of it, Crane's operation is the first thing that comes apart, which means the debt instruments come apart with it. Gavin stared at her. You'd be clear, she said, not through my generosity, through the legal process. Because what Crane built was constructed to survive only as long as the people in it stayed afraid. He was very still. Why are you telling me this? He said. Because you should know what you're choosing when you decide what to do next, she said. You can cooperate with the investigation. Give them Crane, give them Pike, give them everything you know about how the network operates. And whatever you had before this, before Crane, before all of it, you get to try to rebuild it. She paused. Or you can protect Crane and go down with him, and Crane will let you because that's what men like Crane do with the people they've used. Gavin looked at the ground. The floodlights were harsh and flat, and they left nothing soft in anyone's face. The mud, he said quietly, at the funeral. She waited. I've thought about that, he said, every day since, that it was, I don't know what it was. I don't have a good explanation for it. I'm not asking for one, she said. I know? He looked up. His eyes were wet, and she felt nothing about that except a distant recognition. She had spent 4 years feeling things about his pain, managing herself around it, making herself smaller so his discomfort had more room. She was done allocating that space. I'm sorry, Naomi. I believe you, she said. It doesn't change anything, but I believe you. She turned and walked back toward Damien. She didn't look back. Crane was arrested at 6:40 the following morning. He came out of his Lincoln Park residence in a gray robe with the specific blinking confusion of a man who has been woken before dawn by people who are not going to wait for him to be ready. And he stood on his front steps in the cold October morning with 2 federal agents on either side of him and said nothing, which was the smartest thing he'd done in months, and also, Naomi suspected, the thing his attorney had told him to do years ago in preparation for exactly this scenario. Gavin had talked for 4 hours straight the previous night, in a conference room at Miles Harlan's office, with a federal investigator and a recorder running and his own hastily retained attorney present. He'd given them Crane, Pike, the debt network, the communications operation, the court clerk who'd leaked the filing timeline, and the two journalists on Crane's payroll. He'd given them everything with the particular thoroughness of a man who has decided that the only remaining move is to be more useful than anyone else in the room. Pike was taken at his office at 7:15. The state senator, one of the three men with exposure in Arthur's archive, had already retained separate counsel by 6 a.m., which told Naomi he'd had someone monitoring the situation and had moved the moment Crane was taken. The private equity chairman would take longer. He had more infrastructure and more distance from the direct evidence, and his legal team was considerable, and the process of working through what Arthur had documented about his operation would take months. But it would happen. Miles had spent 2 days working with the federal investigators on the archive materials, providing access in a sequence designed to protect the people whose information was held incidentally, the ones who'd been caught in the structure without being part of it, while delivering cleanly the evidence of the ones who had. Arthur had organized the archive for exactly this. Every filing cabinet, every margin note, every carefully placed document that seemed incidental and turned out to be load-bearing. He'd spent 30 years building a structure that could be disassembled precisely when the right moment came, by the right person, in the right way. She had been the right person. She understood this fully now, without the discomfort of it, without the grief-complicated resistance of the first days. He had made her into someone capable of doing this by making her do everything hard. He had not protected her from difficulty. He had put her through it, systematically, because difficulty was the only thing that produced what she had. She sat in the archive room on the morning of Crane's arrest, and she understood her father completely, and she forgave him completely, and those two things happened at the same time, in the same breath, without ceremony. She picked up his pen. She started writing. The gala was Miles's idea. He called it a foundation launch, which was the accurate term, but what it was in practice was a public statement. Naomi Whitmore, in control of the Whitmore Trust, opening the Arthur Whitmore Foundation's first center for women in financial or legal crisis, doing it in front of cameras, doing it standing up. She had not wanted to do it. She had said this to Miles with considerable clarity. She had said she was not interested in a public event designed to function as a narrative correction, that whatever the media had said about her was not something she needed to counter with spectacle, that her father had spent 30 years working quietly, and that quiet was a form of integrity she intended to honor. Miles had listened to all of this. Then he'd said, "The center serves women who are exactly where you were 3 months ago. Isolated, financially trapped, being told they have no standing. If you open this publicly, some of those women will see it." She had agreed to the gala. The venue was a renovated ballroom in downtown Chicago, the kind of space that had been built in an era when public rooms were designed to convey permanence and that had survived several reinventions with its bones intact. Naomi had approved the venue with the specific criteria that it be functional rather than ostentatious. No excess, nothing that would cost more than it served. She arrived in a black velvet gown that she had chosen herself, from a designer who had called her after the media coverage and offered, in a 2-line message that was the most straightforwardly decent communication she'd received from a stranger in months, to make her something that fit the body she actually had. She had said yes. The gown fit perfectly, which was a more radical experience than it should have been, and which she allowed herself to feel without comment. She wore her father's pen pinned inside the jacket she wore over the gown. The room was full. She stood at the entrance for a moment before going in and looked at it. The people, the lights, the cameras positioned along the far wall, the faces of Foundation board members and legal advocates and women who had come through the center's pilot program in the 6 weeks since the legal proceedings had created enough momentum to open the first location. She looked at all of it, and she breathed in the specific way she'd been breathing since the lake, since the maintenance passage, since the mud at the grave, through the nose, steady, refusing to let the moment be bigger than she was. Then she went in. The cameras moved toward her and she let them, not performing ease, but genuinely present, genuinely here, in the room her father had spent 30 years building toward without being able to say so. She spoke to the Foundation board members. She spoke to the pilot program participants. Not at them, not over them, but the specific way of speaking that acknowledges one survivor recognizing another without making theater out of the recognition. She was halfway across the room when she saw Gavin. She had not been told he would be there. He was near the western wall, in a suit that was less carefully chosen than his suits usually were, standing alone, No Vanessa, no Eleanor, no managed public presentation. Just a man who had called Miles Harlan's office 2 weeks ago and asked, through his own attorney, whether he could attend. Miles had relayed the request. Naomi had said nothing for a long time. Then, "He can come." She walked toward him now. Not because she'd planned to, but because walking away would have been a choice too, and she was done making choices based on avoidance. He saw her coming, and something in his posture changed, not straightening, the opposite, the slight contraction of someone who is not sure they deserve the space they're standing in. "You came," she said. "I wasn't sure I should," he said. "Probably not," she said, "but you're here." He looked around the room, at the women from the pilot program, at the foundation signage with Arthur's name on it, at the space that had been built, in its essential structure because of what Gavin had helped enable and what Naomi had survived. "Does it help?" he said. "Doing this." She thought about it honestly. "It doesn't fix what was broken," she said. "That's not how it works. But it makes something out of what was spent." She paused. "My father spent 30 years making something out of what was spent. I'm trying to do the same." Gavin nodded slowly. "Crane's attorneys," he said. "The deposition is next week." "I know. I'm going to tell them everything." "I know," she said again. That's why you're here. Not because you're forgiven, because you made a choice and you're keeping it." He looked at her. "You're different," he said. "I'm the same," she said. "You just see it now." She left him at the western wall and moved through the room toward the podium at the far end. The cameras tracked her. She let them. Wholesome. She had written the speech herself, at Arthur's kitchen table, in the house on Cardwell Street that she had decided to keep, not for sentiment, but because the library was still there, and the bones of the house were good, and because leaving it would have been retreat dressed as practicality, and she was done with that particular disguise. She stood at the podium and looked at the room. She did not open with an apology. She did not open with gratitude. She opened with a fact. "My father spent 30 years protecting other people's stability," she said, without being able to tell anyone, including me, that was what he was doing. He did it because he believed that the way a person earns their place is by making sure the people around them are standing on solid ground. She paused. "He was not a perfect man. He kept things from me that I needed to know. He was better at building structures than he was at building closeness. But he spent his life making sure I would be standing when it counted, and he was right to do it the way he did it, even though I spent a long time not understanding why." The room was very quiet. "This foundation exists because of what he built," she said, "and because of what it cost to build it, and because of what several people paid when they tried to take it, and because of what I learned in the worst 3 months of my life about the difference between being alone and being unsupported." She held the room. "There are women in this city tonight who are sitting in rooms where someone else has decided what they're allowed to believe about themselves. Rooms where the ground has been taken from under them so gradually that they've stopped expecting it to be there. This center exists for those women, not to rescue them, to stand beside them while they find out what they already have." She stopped. She looked at the room for a moment without speaking. Then, "My father would have hated this event. He would have thought the money spent on the catering could have funded 2 more intake coordinators. He would have been right. We're funding 4. A sound moved through the room. Not quite laughter, not quite its opposite. Something that lives between grief and recognition in the specific register of people who understand exactly what is being said. She stepped back from the podium. She found Damien near the east wall, where he had been for most of the evening. Present, visible enough to be read as present, close enough to the edge of the room that he wasn't competing with anyone for the frame. This was a quality she had cataloged about him over 3 months. He understood instinctively whose moment belonged to whom, and he was disciplined about staying out of moments that weren't his. He was looking at her when she reached him. "The speech," he said. "Was long," she said. "Was true," he said. She stood beside him and they looked at the room together, stuffing. At the foundation people and the pilot program women and the journalists and Gavin against the western wall and the cameras and the whole complicated, improbable structure of the evening. A reporter she recognized from the coverage over the past months moved toward them with a recorder extended. Ms. Whitmore, can I ask, in your own words, what role Damien Viscari played in the events of the past months? She looked at Damien. He looked back at her with the specific expression of someone who has decided, absolutely, that he will not provide the answer on her behalf. She turned to the reporter. He stood beside me when the world stepped away, she said. But my father raised me to stand. The reporter looked between them. Damien looked at her, and something in his face, in the careful, controlled architecture of it, moved very slightly in the way that faces move when something true has been said about them that they didn't know was going to be said. Not performance. The real thing. The thing underneath all the things he kept managed. He almost smiled. Not the smile of a man in his position, just a man. They left the gala at 10:15. Not together, separately, in separate vehicles, the way they had arrived, because the evening had been about something other than them, and they had both understood this without discussing it. But he walked her to the car in the way he had walked beside her at the estate, and through the investigation, and through all the difficult middle ground of the past months, with the particular quality of presence that was not ownership and not performance, but something she didn't have an entirely clean word for yet. At the car door, he stopped. The Foundation Board meeting is Thursday, he said. Miles has the agenda. I'll be there, she said. The Crane sentencing will conflict with the February schedule. I'll manage it, she said. I'm good at managing. He looked at her. You are, he said, simply, without embellishment. She got in the car. He closed the door. She looked at him through the window for a moment, at his face in the streetlight, at the man who had watched something wrong happen in a cemetery and refused to walk past it, who had stood beside her through 3 months of deliberately engineered destruction and had never once tried to manage her through it, never tried to tell her what she was or what she was capable of or what she should want. He had simply provided the ground and let her stand on it. The car pulled away. She watched him in the side mirror until the light changed, and he was gone. Oak Ridge Memorial Cemetery was quiet in the early morning. It was always quiet, but in November, with the leaves down and the paths gone from gravel soft to hard, with the first real cold, the quiet had a different texture. Less pastoral, more permanent. The kind of quiet that had been there before the people and would be there after them. Naomi came alone. She had told Cal, who had continued as security in a formal capacity that Miles had arranged with considerable diplomatic care, that she was going to the cemetery and that she would be back in an hour. Cal had begun to say something about protocols. She had looked at him. He had stopped saying it. She parked the Volvo in the same spot she'd parked it 3 months ago, slightly crooked, 2 wheels on the grass verge, and she walked the path to Arthur's grave with the white roses she'd bought from the same florist on Michigan Avenue that had supplied the funeral flowers, because Arthur would have considered any other choice performative, and she stopped at the stone and stood there for a moment in the November cold. The ground was hard and dry. She stood on it in flat shoes and looked at her father's name and thought about everything she hadn't said to him in 32 years and understood finally that he had known most of it anyway. That was the thing about fathers who express love through standards. They pay attention. They know. They just don't always find the language for it before the language becomes unavailable. She kneeled, not in mud, not in this compromised sideways fall of 3 months ago, pushed off balance by a man who had needed her diminished. She kneeled deliberately, the way you kneel when you're making a choice about it, and she placed the roses on the stone and put her hand flat on the granite the way she'd put it on the casket at the funeral. And it was cold in the same way, real and specific and present. Crane gets sentenced in February, Chet, she said. The state senator took a deal. The equity chairman is fighting it, which means it goes to trial, which means everything you documented comes into evidence. Miles says 18 months, probably. She paused. Pike got 3 years, which I think is light. Miles says the cooperation agreement. She stopped. You would have thoughts about the cooperation agreement. You would probably think I was too lenient. You were always harder on expediency than I am. The wind moved through the trees in the older section of the cemetery, a dry sound against bare branches. The Foundation's first center is open, she said. The second location is funded. I've been sleeping at the lake house, your lake house, the one you told me was a faculty retreat for 10 years. I'm not angry about that anymore. I understand why. I'm going to be angry about other things for a while, probably. She paused. The way you didn't fight it. When people looked at me the way they looked at me, you watched it and you decided resilience was enough. And I need more time with that one. I'm not there yet. She sat with that honesty for a moment. Let it be what it was without resolution. Gavin is cooperating, she said. I don't know what he becomes after. That's not mine to know. She thought about his face at the western wall. The suit that wasn't quite right. The man underneath the performance who had always been there and who she had spent 4 years trying to reach and who had spent 4 years choosing not to be reachable. I think he was always frightened, she said. Fear is not an excuse, but it's a fact. She stood up. She brushed the dried grass off her knee. She looked at the stone for a long moment without speaking, the way you look at something you are about to leave. Not for the last time, but for this time, with the specific attention of someone who understands that ordinary moments are not ordinary. Everyone saw me fall that day, she said. But you knew I would rise. The wind moved. She stayed one more moment. Then she turned and walked back toward the car. Not hurrying, not performing composure, just walking at her own pace on her own ground through a cemetery on a cold November morning, carrying her father's pen in her inside pocket, and the weight of 3 months of survival on her frame, the way you carry the weight of things that have genuinely cost you. Not hidden, not displayed, just present. At the gate she stopped. She put her hand on this iron post and looked back once at the cemetery. At the paths and the stones and the old trees and the specific plot in the middle distance where Arthur Whitmore lay under his own name in the ground that would hold him for the rest of time. She thought about what Damien had said. In the kitchen on the first night, there's a difference between standing alone and standing unsupported. She understood it now the way you understand things that have been demonstrated rather than explained. She had stood alone her whole life. She was not alone. These were both true. She let go of the gatepost. She walked to the car. She got in. She adjusted the seat, not for a man 6 inches taller than her, but for herself, for the body she was actually in, the one she had run through a frozen tree line in and put a man down with at a lake edge in the dark and carried 3 months of siege through without breaking. And she pulled out onto the cemetery road and drove. The city was ahead of her. Everything that came next was ahead of her. She drove toward it without hurrying, with the specific steadiness of a woman who has stopped waiting to be given permission to arrive, and the morning opened around her the way mornings open, indifferently, generously, without concern for who deserves them. And she drove through it as herself, as the woman Arthur had spent 30 years building the ground for, as the woman who had finally, at the cost of everything easy, stood up and stayed standing. Not because anyone told her she was enough, because she already was. She always had been. She just hadn't had the ground to stand on long enough to know it. The road opened. She drove. The city received her without ceremony, the way cities receive everyone, without judgment, without welcome, just space. She filled it.